That very special time period between the mid-70s and the mid-90s saw that the Big Four Japan was pushing the envelope of motorcycle technology in an attempt to literally create the proverbial box in which one thinks outside of. By the time the 2000s came around, the formula had largely been set for a lot of motorcycle classes. For the last 20 years, it's just been a refinement of each formula, and thus 4 completely solid choices for whatever you might want, for the most part at least. Competition among the Big Four to get the best foothold in certain unproven classes during that time spawned some of the most interesting motorcycles that even now you can look back on and appreciate. And plus, this is just a plain old fun story too. So what do you know about forced induction, supercharging, and turbocharging? Well, whatever level of knowledge you possess on the topic is likely thanks to experience with automobiles, as the use of forced induction is extremely rare on factory motorcycles. Simply put, a turbocharger repurposes exhaust gas to spin a turbine that spins an impeller that is used to draw in and compress air for engine intake. Compressing air allows you to create a higher concentration of oxygen, and if you match this dense air charge with more fuel to burn, you get a bigger boom, and thus more power from combustion. This is pretty simple. Downside lies in the fact that the whole system is gas-based, and thus there's this rubber banding effect, or lag. You open the throttle, and the amount of exhaust gas produced affects the speed of the turbo, which affects the amount of boosted air. Eventually, all of these factors reach an optimal state, and the power just jumps up rapidly. But this can occur way after you crack open the throttle, and rather snappily. Superchargers have the same goal as turbochargers, but instead of being driven by exhaust gases, they are directly driven by the engine in a way that an air conditioner is. That means superchargers deliver more constant and controlled boost because it is always spinning at a correct proportionate rate as the engine. Solid metals or belts linking the engine and the compressor is more direct than just literal exhaust gas. The downside being that the solid connection saps a percentage of power from the engine, even though it gives more back in return. Does that make sense? Just for the sake of letting you know, very commonly you'll find intercoolers to cool off the compressed intake charge because compressing air also heats it up. With bikes, we've all heard of the turbo high boosters that permeate those highway and drag racing channels, but those are all custom built jobs, and unless you lived under a rock for the past few years, you've also heard of the Ninja H2s as well. But before all that, there was the 1980s, which was the decade of turbocharging. I mean, it started in the 70s, but it swelled in the 80s, and I really do mean that. Have you noticed all those cheeseball turbo badges and decals of the 80s? I mean, geez, I secretly love this stuff, but you have to admit it looks kind of goofy as hell these days. But these days are different because now turbocharging is what you do to your base model, your economy-focused car. Have you noticed that if a manufacturer today creates a high-performance, naturally aspirated car, everybody loses their minds? There's been a paradigm shift in the past few decades. But anyway, come with me back to the 80s. Honda was still being a huge nerd that it's always been since the GP days. Of the other 3 Japanese companies, Yamaha was the most ambitious to take down the red wing. So look, in 1980, Honda, in its typical show-off, teacher's pet, science fair-winning high-tech fashion, displayed this turbocharged prototype bike. That alone was a power move because the bike wasn't even ready to sell until 1982. Naturally, all the press that Honda gained from the premise of a turbo bike lit a fire under everybody else's ass to get a turbo bike to market. While those guys are figuring their shit out, let's talk about the 1982 CX500 Turbo.
5 years ago, a team of Honda engineers set out to create the world's most advanced motorcycle. The result of their efforts is the Honda CX500 Turbo, a water-cooled, fuel-injected, turbocharged motorcycle, systematically controlled by a digital computer. The CX500 Turbo. The only thing about it that is not surprising is the name of the company that built it.
The CX series was this longitudinally mounted pushrod V-twin powered bike with a shaft drive introduced for the 1978 model year. A lot of people write off the original CX bikes as slow, frumpy, Moto Guzzi knockoffs, but the CX500 had actually checked off a few things from the bucket list for Honda back in the late 70s. In fact, it was their first V-twin, it was their first liquid-cooled motorcycle, and other notable things about it was that the cylinder heads were actually twisted in such a way that the intake was tucked into the frame so as to not interfere with the operator's knees. The side effect of this twist meant that the overhead cams that Honda preferred couldn't be used, so they just used push rods instead for valve actuation. Even though the original CX was naturally aspirated, some people say that the CX was actually built from the start as a potential candidate for turbocharging. And that might go to my point earlier about Honda noticing the fad earlier before, all the other guys. Maybe that's why it's understood that these engines are quite bomb-proof. And despite the CX bikes never ever being known for their performance, the motors themselves were pretty strong and liquid cooled. Remember how I mentioned that intercooling is a standard method for cooling off the intake charge? Well, this bike was designed without one, so Honda felt that they needed a liquid cooled bike. Remember, this concept dated back to 1980. when this was the first and only liquid-cooled bike that Honda had, so no Magnas or Sabres yet. So the original naturally aspirated CX500 made like 50 horsepower, but the CX500 Turbo made 82 horsepower, which is a massive jump by any stretch. The bike even checked off some bucket list points like the original one, with it being the first Honda to run computerized digital fuel injection, used to help tame the power of the turbo and to balance out the air-fuel ratio. At full jet, the turbo will produce 19 psi of boost, which is pretty impressive on a bike, allowing the middleweight to produce power comparable to a leader bike. It wasn't just the power plant that was upgraded though. The bike actually had Honda's monoshock ProLink suspension, a fork anti-dive control, air assist, star wheels, and triple disc brakes all around like the later updates for the CX. Best part of all, the turbo gauge, devoid of any pressure values whatsoever. In fact, the turbo branding, when looked at nowadays, could be comfortably seen as being done in jest, but again, this was just what you did at the time. Honestly, the way the word turbo is stamped onto the muffler in such a way that it's as big as the word Honda, it just makes me laugh a little.
Basically, Honda have taken their established CX500 and they've added a turbocharger, but the story's not quite as simple as that. Here on Wheels, we've seen in early car applications how sudden gouts of uncontrollable power that are developed as the turbocharger starts spinning make cars very difficult to drive smoothly and predictably. Now, you put that combination through a single motorbike rear wheel, especially on wet roads, and you've got a potential disaster on your hand. Will all the dealers be selling them, or?
No, we've been very careful to select the dealers who are already most capable of handling a machine as sophisticated as this. And for the first year, there'll only be 60 dealers spread throughout the United Kingdom.
Now,
the turbo was mounted at the front of the bike behind the fairing to allow for some air cooling, even having scoops built into the front fender to channel air in that direction. When it came to intake, air was routed from the front of the CX through an oiled foam air filter and then into the compressor part of the IHI-made turbo. Air traveled to a plastic box called a surge tank and then through reed valves and intake tubes into the engine. Fuel passed through a fuel filter before being pushed under pressure by an electric fuel pump where it was fed to the injectors, all of which was controlled by the computer under the seat, even having a sort of limp mode tune, I guess, to get you home if something goes wrong. That didn't stop the bike from achieving very poor gas mileage though. So, how did it ride? Polarizing. Yeah, by all accounts it seems that after folks get over the novelty of sitting over a turbo, they were either left loving or hating it. I mean, let's be honest, look at it. Like, it has all the right bells and whistles of an early 80s sporty middleweight, chassis-wise, albeit quite a bit heavy at 581 pounds wet. But the engine dynamics is what you have to consider. I mean, it's just a little 500cc, and the boost typically came on at about 4,000 RPM. So what you would start out with is this tiny amount of power pulling this heavy bike before the turbo spools up and kicks you in the ass. And there's two types of people in the world. There's those who find that uncontrollable and extremely fun, and there's those who find that uncontrollable and extremely dumb. Like, I've been reading period reviews, and the same exact characteristics of this bike being a bit of a wild child are given as reasons alongside completely polarized conclusions. Honda heard the criticisms and they sought to improve this extremely polarizing turbo lag that the CX500 suffered from. The 500 lasted only one model year before it was replaced by the CX650 for the 1983 model year. For the 1983 model year, the displacement for all CXs, turbo or otherwise, was increased to 673cc, creating an increase in power across the board. With regards to the turbo model, the compression ratio was increased and the maximum boost was lowered, which allowed for a reduction in lag and also a smoother transition into boost. The fuel injection system was revised for the CX650 Turbo, and the rear shock received manually adjustable damping control. It appeared that this revision had fixed the lag issues, and even though the boost was dropped, it still made more power than the 500 at 100 horsepower. Alright, the truth is, Honda pulling that unusual power move back in 1980 allowed for its closest rival, Yamaha, to get a turbocharged bike to market the same year they got the CX500 Turbo out. And I don't know if it was a happy accident for Yamaha to have to rush their bike out the door to meet Honda's schedule, or even if given ample time, they would have made this bike the same exact way that they did. Alright, let me explain. This is the Yamaha XJ650 Seca Turbo.
This is the Porsche 930 Turbo, one of the world's fastest accelerating automobiles. And this is Yamaha's new Seca Turbo. Exactly how quick is the Yamaha Turbo? Ask the guy in the Porsche.
It's a turbo motorcycle, yes. But in a way similar to the story of those rotary bikes with Suzuki versus Norton, a video that you can find here, Yamaha took an extremely simple approach to turbocharging compared to Honda. The Yams had an air-cooled 2-valve, tried-and-true 4-banger from the already existent XJ650 versus the 4-valve liquid-cooled Honda. The Yamaha had carburetors versus Honda's the Yams had typical crusty twin shocks, while Honda had this air monoshock. The Yams had a drum brake. out back, while Honda had discs all around. And this is not even retrospective. This was noted even at the time. Here's a period quote on the topic. In the real world sense, Yamaha's Turbo was a somewhat smarter effort than its rival. I'm not doing this. In the real world sense, Yamaha's Turbo is a somewhat smarter effort than its rival, precisely because fewer surges of brainpower were expended in its making. Honda built a CX500 TC to hook all the hardware junkies, enhance the prestige of its engineering staff, and to let everyone know what can be expected from a mere 500 cubic centimeters of displacement when filing is done with tamper. For such reasons, and because the CX500 V-twin only reluctantly lent itself to turbocharging, Honda made its Turbo a fuel-injected, gadget-laden, technological tour de force. By contrast, Yamaha seemingly borrowed the Honda advertising slogan, "We make it simple," for inspiration when the XJ650 LJ was being designed. They made it simple. I mean, this shit is like being burned for being a smart kid in class. Alright, so the XJ650 Turbo made just under 90 horsepower through its simple means. Compared to Honda, that wasn't as big as a jump from the original XJ650, which had 70 horses. This is because the Mitsubishi-made turbo on the Yams was actually a little smaller than the turbo on the CX, which was impressive because the one on the CX was already the smallest turbo ever made. They also only shoved about 8 PSI through it, which was less than half of the Honda's 18 PSI. I can't help but think about how much more powerful this bike could have been. I mean, Yamaha definitely pulled punches, probably out of good morals and also because of concerns for reliability. I'm not sure if they would have had to shell out some extra dough for EFI or if they could have pulled it off with carbs. I don't know. I mean, aside from cooling, on paper it would be a better candidate for boosting anyway, as it has a quick breathing and quick revving 4-banger as opposed to a dopey V-twin. The pulses of exhaust feed of the turbo also had less space between firing, naturally thanks to having 4 cylinders instead of 2. It had more displacement and more cylinders to put air into, meaning, less stress on everything. Unlike the CX's turbo was actually placed under the bike in front of the rear wheel because it was small enough to be tucked back there. I mean, this meant that you lost some of the fanfare of seeing the headers shoot directly into a turbo at the front of the bike, but this was a smart, practical use of space. Due to the smaller size of the turbo, it spooled up quicker, which meant less lag. The right muffler was actually only connected to the wastegate and only expels exhaust at max boost. The intake featured a surge tank, reed valves, and an electronic fuel pump like the Honda, but the engine was fed through 30 mil constant velocity Makunis. The pump was needed because without it, the boost would literally shove the fuel out of the carb and back into the gas tank. The carburetor and surge tank system did a pretty good job at delivering the correct mixture and even bypassing boost if need be. It was even able to account for altitude changes with double tapered jet needles, altering the level of fuel passing by in relation to air. For longevity, Yamaha actually included NOx sensors, forged pistons, better flowing heads, hotter cams, oil flow improvements, and dropped the compression ratio when compared to the normal XJ650. This hot new XJ650 Turbo was also featured in the James Bond movie Never Say Never Again. This is actually a really fun chase to watch, but Hollywood fame aside, the glaring issues still remain. Yamaha simply couldn't engineer turbo lag out of the bike. By all sources, it was less than a Honda, but it was still there. Motorcyclist magazine conducted a comparison between the Honda and the Yamaha, and according to them, the Honda was slightly quicker, but they both did the quarter mile in the mid 12-second range. Problem is that these bikes were still not as fast as the 11-second liter bikes, but still had all the weight of a liter bike. All the extra weight was so apparent that testers noted that riding the bikes out of boost made them feel even slower than the lighter, non-boosted bikes that they were based on. To very quickly respond to the criticisms and perhaps save the turbo bike segment, Honda released the CX650 with its improvements that I mentioned earlier, to no real avail, as the bike was even shorter lived than the 500, even though it was better in every way by admission of the press. So that was Honda and Yamaha pushing and shoving each other to get a turbo out. But what about Suzuki and Kawasaki? Well, it was kind of unfortunate for them, but after 1 Yamaha and 2 Hondas, the public pretty much saw that this turbo trend wasn't really going anywhere. And quite frankly, despite a few changes and improvements among all the bikes that maybe kind of went into Kawasaki's favor, it was all mostly the same. Still, we have 2 more bikes to talk about, starting with the 1983 Suzuki XN85. Take a look at all 3 bikes and what's the biggest difference you see here ergonomically. I hope you said the super low clip-ons because the turbo bikes before this had some high-mounted bars, perhaps due to that being the case of the bikes that they were based on. But the XN85 was actually pretty much a new machine chassis-wise, with the reworked motor to support boost and more power. The engine was the air-cooled 673cc inline-4 from the GS650, and with all the upgrades, it produced 85 horses, thus the 85 in the name. The XN85 was focused on being an exceptionally handling bike with more race replica values, which makes sense as Suzuki still hadn't dropped the first sport bike as we know it. the 85 GSX-R 750. The XN85 weighed a little less than the others at 550 pounds, and with the right rider, it could actually do 11s in a quarter mile. Like the Yamaha, the Suzuki was air-cooled, but the 9.6 PSI turbo was mounted inside the frame behind the cylinders. Typical stuff with the engine, strengthened internals, better flow, yada yada. But the thing is, the XN85 was set apart from the competition through its commitment to more sporty values as opposed to just riding nice. The main frame was a round tube double cradle style with a triangulated backbone running to the steering head. 37mm Kayaba forks with anti-dive and air adjustability. The fork connected to a 16-inch front wheel, which was something you only really seen on racing stuff. Even with a long wheelbase, the bike handled extremely well. It had an aluminum swing arm and a single monoshock having remote hydraulic preload adjustment. The system was called the Suzuki Full Floater, a name that has not aged well. By pretty much all accounts that I've seen, the engine was nothing testers had already seen with the other bikes, but they were taken aback by the handling and the overall performance of the XN85. The Suzuki came with electronic fuel injection and a smart ignition system. The lag was noticeable, but at least less than the competition. Overall, I think the XN85 might be the least known of the turbo bikes, despite all its graces. When it comes to Kawasaki, I've been withholding some information. The Kawi that was released for the 1984 model year was the Kawasaki GPZ-750 Turbo, and that was the final say in the 1980s turbo race. But Kawasaki had actually sold the turbo bike in 1978 in the form of the ZR1 TC. But the reason why it hardly counts is it wasn't factory made. It was sold through American Kawasaki dealers in 1978, but it was just made by bolting on an aftermarket turbo pack kit to a stock Z1R with no other changes by a company called TCC or Turbo Cycle Company. Power was up from 94 horses on the original Z1R to 125 or so horses, which was really way more than the bike could handle due to the poorly suited chassis and engine. The bikes went to TCC as regular Z1s and were converted there, then sold at dealers. Different paint options, exhausts, and wastegate revisions denote what generation each turbo bike was from. It was sold through dealers as a sort of aftermarket kit bike, and as such there was no warranty off it. If you bought this death trap, you had to sign a waiver acknowledging that whatever goes wrong has nothing to do with us. Hell, there were actually recommendations in the manual that new owners upgrade to stronger valve springs, weld the crank, and upgrade the clutch if this thing was going to be used aggressively. Now, how much faith could you really put in a thing like this? This bike is not real. It's an aftermarket slap job that no one trusted, many crashed, and they only made 500 of. But you gotta love it for that. Even with all that said, the real Kawasaki turbo bike came in the form of the GPZ-750T. Thing is, if you follow my videos on the Speed Wars, you know what Kawasaki prioritizes. Raw speed. And as the final turbocharged offering of the Big Four, they wanted you to know why theirs is better.
Kawasaki have always been acknowledged as the manufacturer of high-performance motorcycles. Typically, the Kawasaki Z750 Turbo is the world's fastest production turbocharged bike. Kawasaki is an engineer's company, and it shows.
Several turbocharged motorcycles have been developed to date, but none have achieved just the right blend between weight, power, and performance. Until now, that combination has remained out of the reach of engineers. Until now, that is.
See, Kawasaki saw Honda release its 1980 prototype to the press, but proved to be not nearly as thirsty as Yamaha. You know, Yamaha saw Honda do it and then flung out a simple, but let's be honest, half-assed bike to compete with Honda in 1982. In 1981, Kawasaki put out a concept bike, but literally ultimately decided to scratch it for something better, because if Kawasaki is good at anything, it's outdoing themselves when no one asked. The 750 Turbo came out last, but made a chart-topping 112 horsepower. More than even the CX650's 100 horsepower. That allowed the 750 to do high 10s at the quarter, which makes sense because the head of engineering himself said horsepower comes first, we want to build the fastest motorcycle. And they certainly got what they wanted, because not only was it the fastest, but it achieved the goal of taking a middleweight bike and making it as fast as the 1100cc GPZ.
In conventional engines, a large amount of energy is carried away as exhaust gas and wasted. Turbocharging harnesses this energy and uses it to force a higher volume of air through the engine, increasing its effective displacement. Kawasaki's turbocharger is placed directly under the exhaust ports in front of the engine block. Such proximity reduces turbo lag to an absolute minimum, and because the center of gravity is low, handling is improved. With the introduction of the Kawasaki 750 Turbo, the full potential of turbocharged motorcycles has finally been realized. We asked some of the world's best-known motorcycle writers for their appraisal of the new Turbo from Kawasaki.
It's running really good on the racetrack. It's a lot nicer to ride than the GPZ-1100 because it has much less weight, the brakes work better, has better tires on it, and more cornering clearance. So you can actually ride it faster under 99% of the conditions than the 1100. And I know it's running on the 1100 following the turbos are just as quick. 1100 will pick up on it, top gear maybe 90 to 100 miles an hour. And the turbo is just as quick all the rest of the time. It's the most successful turbo that I've ridden.
Very good.
It's a very good bike. It's got the power of the GPZ-1100 with the handling of a 750. It's a sporty bike. It's really great. It's easy to handle, and it's very quick. A fast, sporty machine. It's the best turbo.
It doesn't seem to have turbo lag. It just seems to get faster and faster and faster.
It's unanimous. Kawasaki has produced the world's best turbocharged motorcycle. At the Salzburg rink in Austria, journalists from around the world attended the unveiling of the new Kawasaki machine, putting the new turbo through standing 400-meter sprints in an impressive 11.2 seconds. Later, American rider Pee Wee Gleason slashed this to 10.71 seconds for the quarter mile, making the Kawasaki 750 Turbo the world's quickest production motorcycle.
You got fuel injection, low compression, stronger internals, the typical stuff you'd expect here, even down to the chassis like the air suspension and aluminum swing arm. In this case, the turbo was a Hitachi unit mounted up in front of the headers like the Honda. It's very satisfying because the final turbo bike of this era was, by most accounts, the absolute best. The praise that the 750 had received was deserved, but the writing was on the wall, and it shortly became very clear that forced induction factory motorcycles would become just a footnote in history, because the fact is, the legendary Ninja 900 released that same year and had about the same horsepower without any goofy or complex turbo system. The equally fast, beautifully sculpted, slick handling, reasonably affordable, and lag-free DNA of the 900 so that the whole turbo experimental phase was done, and it actually ended up cannibalizing the sales of the 750 Turbo, which was only produced until 1985. I mean, the 900 was so good that it was worthy of Tom Cruise's crazy squid ass. When you consider naturally aspirated bikes like the Yamaha XJ1100 or the FZ750 or the GSXR 750, 1100 or the Honda Hurricanes, you know, these bikes were pushing 100 horsepower and presented a new generation of lighter, more powerful leader bikes in 750 classes. The need for turbocharged middleweights was pretty much gone. So what I'm saying is that improvements to chassis dynamics, weight, naturally aspirated power made it so that you could get the best of all worlds in a lot of bikes. Or if you wanted to buy a big boy bike that broke speed records, you didn't even need a turbo. The need for technological band-aids had begun to disappear. Remember, turbo bikes were cursed with lag, poor mileage, barely controllable power, they were expensive, and they were cannibalized by often faster leader bikes, and they were hard to insure. Now, these turbo bikes cost even more of a pretty penny these days because just how quickly they came and went. I mean, can you imagine something like that these days? I mean, a 3-year span in which manufacturers race to produce some crazy new tech, and then all of them just drop. I mean, you could say the next frontier is electric, but that's pretty much certain at this point. It's not a matter of giving it a shot. Pretty soon, that's pretty much all we're gonna have with the way that the planet is melting. Period. Now, in typical speed freak fashion, Kawasaki came back with a supercharged bike in the form of the H2, and that's available in sport, track, naked, and touring trims. The thing is, no one else has really showed an interest in matching the fun with a boosted bike. Kawasaki went for a crankshaft-driven supercharger solution, most likely because this system is not affected by the lag that turbochargers have to deal with. At around 14,000 RPM, the step-up gear rotates around 2,000 revs higher, driving a planetary gear system which multiplies the rotation speed to around 130,000 RPM. creating a huge air pressure boost. The aircraft-inspired planetary gear system is what allows the impeller that pulls the boosted air in to spin at ridiculous speeds. Now let's be real here, the H2 series of bikes deserves its own video, and I won't get into it too deep here, and quite frankly I'm surprised that I never did a video on it. It's miles ahead of the bikes from the 1980s, and I think that regardless of whatever your favorite brand is, we should all commend Kawasaki for even coming back and making it, given the rocky history of boosted bikes. Having done all this research for this video, I'm left with a huge appreciation for not only the H2's existence, but also those old boosted bikes from the early 80s. What an interesting time that must have been. Hopefully you feel the same. Thanks for watching.